Pride and Prejudice, and 367 pages of balls and young men, by a lady. Chapter 1. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a nice little pair of balls must be in want of a large penis. However little the balls of such a man may be, they always continue to grow sufficiently in anticipation of their intercourse with cunties. The Netherfield ladies, Mr. Bingley, his 18 sisters, and the Phillipses, the Lucases, and the officers, 2 nephews of the younger son of his Uncle Muffins, Stephen and Dean, and the husband of her brothers and sisters, a little cucumber, Mr. Dirty, and Captain Breakfast, and another young man, were all standing about in a fucking stupid manner at the Netherfield Ball ages ago. Mrs. Bennet's eyes sparkled with pleasure, and she was eagerly calling out, "Fucking farties rectums, too. I love cocks and testes, too, do. I like them, yes, I do. Fucking farties rectums, too." Here she was interrupted again by Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy. He danced here and he danced there, fancying himself so very great. What a cont! She was therefore obliged to sit down, fingering her ass-hole. "My fingers," cried Mrs. Bennet as she stuck 3 into her fat fudge factory, "do not move over this instrument in the masterly manner which I see so many women's do. They have not the same force or rapidity, but then I have always supposed it to be my own fault, because I would not take the trouble of practising, because I was afraid of my aunt." Her colour changed, and she said no more. "It is your turn to say something now, Mr. Darcy," cried Elizabeth. "I talked about Mr. Bingley's large foreskin, and you ought to make some kind of remark on the stiffness of the dick, or the size of the room, or the number of couples, or the number of peaches, or the number of porridge, or the number of... Perhaps by and by," she added, "I may observe that Spanish balls are much pleasanter than French ones. Or at least you could say something about my fucking sister Mary. Her performance on the pianoforte is shitty. La, la, sang Mary. Mr. Bingley, who had taken ecstasy, lay on the instrument, nude, with a mind occupied by 1,000 tender erections, and spent the rest of the evening in walking about the room with his delicate little cock triumphantly displayed. It was rather small, but well built and convenient, and a ball was, at any rate, a ball. Mr. Bingley soon swallowed up every private in the room. Nothing could be more delightful. To be filleted by a young man of frisky capers and a nice, noisy, boisterous behind, and of beautiful, honourable, noble, respectable, agreeable, gentlemanlike whole, and 2 elegant nuts, each of them infinitely superior to one another. His character was decided. Mr. Bingley was a blow-job master. He smiled, looked handsome, he sucked every PP, and said many pretty things, and talked of giving one to himself at Netherfield. "He is as fine a fellow," said Mr. Bennet, "as ever I saw. He sucks and makes love to us all." Darcy smiled. "Darcy clever," said he. "Darcy's superior. Darcy got the firmest peeviness in the world," and adding, with a significant smile, "Darcy haughty to the max." "That reply will do for the present," said Elizabeth. "Now I do insist upon it that you have a very small peep at my cunt." He did look at it and into it for half an hour, with about as much delight as at home. Oh! And when it came to the point, so little liked her muff that he told her to fuck off, and almost turned highly gay. He walked away. The absolute fact. She was humbled, she was grieved, she grumbled, she heaved. Mr. Bennet saw that her hole was so untidy, so disgusting, that he was sick and wretched like an abominable pussy over their whole bodies. "Oh, shit!" cried Elizabeth. "What?" said Mr. Bennet. Elizabeth's warm and musty muff had 2 large flaps flying about, for at any rate there seemed a gulf between them. Her pubes reminded him of the shrubbery behind the house. From such a cunt she could not wonder that he should shrink. Her meat curtains were pronounced to be very bad indeed. They had no style, no taste, no beauty. "Oh, my dear pussy," cried Elizabeth, "that is the most unforgiving stink," though she hardly knew of what. Probably fish, or some curious water plant. I dislike it very much, Mr. Bennet replied. But there are two things that I want very much to know. One is how to say bosom in Italian, and the other, is it bosom? Pride and Prejudice and Praise and Porridge and Presents and Pedantic Ponies and Pride and Pride and Pride and Proud and Pride and a little bit of hot sex. By Jane Austen. Chapter 2. After sitting a little with Jane on Miss Bingley's face, Mr. Collins, awkward and solemn and frightened of God, stood by Elizabeth for some minutes in silence, and at last whispered, "If I," said Mr. Collins, "let Mr. Darcy seem my old wide behind, I should have great pleasure, I am sure, in obliging the Count, for I consider the rectum of a clergyman as a very innocent perversion, and I do not think it of light importance that he should have general inspection of my tender, short, active, useful sort of penis, which, as I have already said, is seriously pointy. I shall entreat his pardon for not having done it earlier. I believe him to be a simpleton, and perhaps he might give me £40,000 in the Forbes Inn, and perhaps he might give me a sheet of paper with some drawings of Father Christmas sharing the same mince pie, the food of love, with Lady Catherine de Bourgh, drawn as a horsewoman with a large sword. That is not very likely." Elizabeth tried hard to dissuade him from such a scheme, assuring him that Mr. Darcy would consider his genitals offensive rather than a compliment to his Willie. But alas, he had already taken the end of the dick out in the most serious manner. This roused a general astonishment, and he had the pleasure of being gay. Kitty stared at him, and Lydia exclaimed, "Oh, no." "Oh, yes," replied Mr. Collins. "Oh, no," said Elizabeth. "Oh, yes," said he. After amusing himself some time with masturbation, Mr. Collins had followed his nice through the hall towards Mr. Darcy. Her cousin prefaced his speech with a solemn bow, and though she could not hear a word of it, she saw in the motion of his lips the words apology, intercourse, circumcised, cheeks, tackle, do the business, and Lady Catherine de Bourgh. It vexed her to see him expose himself to such a man. "You need not undress yourself," said Mr. Darcy, looking at the little cocked face. "I am not in a humour to wait for an opening of yours. You are tolerable, but not handsome enough to tempt me. Your portion is unhappily so small that it will in all likelihood undo the effects of your loveliness and amiable qualifications, of which you have fuck all. Believe me, my dear Mr. Farty, third person," said Mr. Collins very gravely, "you could not have met with a person more capable of giving you head than myself, for I drink a bottle of wine every day, mixed with sprog. But before I am run away with by my want of penetration, perhaps it would be advisable for me to state my reasons for my desire of being loved by your long satisfactory particulars." Mr. Darcy felt his own arse, and immediately said, "I beg you would not put my little lizard into your hole of love. Heaven forbid! As you are as handsome as a pack of foxhounds, that would be insupportable. But, however, you may suck my hearty cock of temptation from the bewitching testes, so remarkably fine, finer finery than the finest fruits in season, to the Archbishop of Stiffness, Mr. Cockings." This was invitation enough. Lydia gaped as he opened the fly. "Dear me, I never saw such a long, unbending erection in my life." And Mrs. Hurst, principally occupied in playing with her bosoms and rings, looked eagerly round the room, and covering her face with her handkerchief, she turned from sister to sister, demanding their congratulations, and when at length they all sat down, she observed with a laugh that they all sat down. Elizabeth was delighted. She had never seen a prick for which nature had done more, or where natural beauty had been so little counteracted by an awkward tattoo. Its balls were neither formal nor falsely adorned. To be sure, it was a beautiful object, and the ladies all felt that he must wee a little further than other rich men. Elizabeth, after slightly surveying it, went to a window to enjoy 3 or 4 healthful and lovely farties, which naturally led to the death of half the good people in Meryton, with no expectation of pleasure, but just done to give pleasure to Miss Darcy. Mr. Collins put his lips violently between the 2 beautiful work-bags which were slightly colouring. This was exactly as it should be. Both changed colour. One looked white, the other red. A redness at the same time perfectly correct and unassuming, and red. "I have seen them both," cried he, with an air of awkward gallantry. And after giving each of them a hasty kiss, he began tending to them in every way, teaching them, playing with them, and loving them. But his friend Mr. Darcy said, with a look of haughty composure, "You want the girls, you get my dick, you want a wife, but you are a fuckwit, suck my balls, Church of England cunt. What a go, fuck your mother's ass twice." But alas, Mr. Collins's mouth was too full for conversation, and wholly engrossed by his mouth being so full of balls, sucked them in silence. "How nicely they are crammed in," cried Lydia. "Come, Darcy," cried Bingley, "I must have you come. I hate to see you standing about with no come in this stupid manner. You had much better come." "I certainly shall not." "Oh," he replied, biting his lips, "you know how I detest it." "Oh, unless I am particularly acquainted with my yes, partner. Oh, at such an assembly as this it would, good God, be insupportable." "Ah!" He proceeded to burst forth all over Mr. Collins, covering him with white soup, with many rapturous expressions, and, after discharging his keenness on that head, admitted a most refreshing fart. The scent quickly spread through the drawing-room, and with proportionate speed through the house, and instead of entering the park, turned up the lane, past one of the gates into the village, and did much good among the poor. Mr. Collins bowed and smiled like a stupid, bloody mother-fucking ass-faced cunt. "I have been most highly gratified indeed, my dear sir," said he. But Mr. Darcy had walked away to another part of the room, and now nothing remains for me but to fuck myself in the most animated manner. But a deeper shade of hauteur overspread his features before he had advanced many steps, and from actual weakness sat down and cried for half an hour. "I'm cruelly used. Nobody feels for my poor pathetic, paler than usual peevedness, not to mention my neglected anal passage. Oh, how I wanted you! 6 inches deep in my aunt's cheeks. Look here," cried Miss Elizabeth, shaking her head. "There is a fine old saying, which everybody here is of course familiar with, 'Keep your breath to cool your coffee and muffins,' and I shall keep mine to swell my salad and cucumber. So fuck off." Pride and Prejudices, Chapter 3, etc. "Miss Bennet," said Lady Catherine, as she gave her particulars 6 pinches, "there seems to be a prettyish kind of a little wilderness on one side of your lawn. I should be glad to take a turn in it, if you will favour me with a sheet of paper. I must have my shite. There are few people in England, I suppose, who have a more true enjoyment of doing a little bit of warm poo, or a better natural taste, or a better natural stink, or a better natural desirable behind. My arse shoot is a capital one, probably superior to your mother, who is such an ugly, stupid piece of fucking shit. I am very good at breaking wind most strenuously. I'm always glad to get farties out, Miss Bennet. It is wonderful how many shits I have accidentally made in that way," said Lady Catherine, "and it was but the other day that I shitted 5 out at once." "Let us hear all the particulars," said Mr. Bennet, not forgetting their comparative height and size. "You have a very small dick," returned Lady Catherine after a short silence, and, turning to Elizabeth, said, "Do your sisters play and fart and shit and paint tables and yawn and net purses and groan and dide and laugh at porridge and take a turn about the room after shitting out beautiful pyramids of grapes, nectarines, and peaches?" "One of them does." "Oh, then some time or other we shall be happy to hear her." Elizabeth, feeling really anxious, longed to speak but could think of nothing to say, and after a short silence, though with some difficulty, she farted. "Oh," said Lady Catherine. "How well it sounds!" cried her mother, and her spirits were very differently affected when, to her utter amazement, she saw Mr. Darcy walk into the room. Woe! And with these words he hastily left the room, and Elizabeth heard him the next moment open the front door and quit the house. "I admire the activity of your bottom," observed Mary. "But every impulse of feeling from your bottom should be guided by feeling one's own bottom, and in my opinion, whose opinion of bottom is the wisest and best opinion in the world, I think I have the best bottom in the north of England." She then sat still 5 minutes longer, but unable to waste such a precious occasion, she suddenly got up and ran out of the room, flatulating all the while, and returned no more till she heard them passing wind on Mrs. Bennet's face. With 2 or 3 joints, Mr. Bennet was regardless of time, and on the present occasion he had a good deal of "poo," so brown and coarse, coming out of his fine, tall anus, though while it was passing, the enjoyment of it had been little. "Good God!" cried he, "I am sorry it went off, but these things happen so often." "How can you be so silly," cried his wife impatiently, "as to sit in your aunt's?" Elizabeth blushed and blushed again with shame and vexation. "I wish I could produce large mixed poo pies," said Elizabeth, "and of course elegant little hot-pressed pupils on the table, sometimes dirty and sometimes cold, well covered with a lady's fair flowing piece. At present, however, I consider myself as constipated, and therefore I am not in such circumstances as to make shit." "You are joking, Lizzie," cried Jane, slightly colouring. "This cannot be." Elizabeth could hardly help smiling as she assured her with much earnest gravity that it fucking could. "Good heaven! Can it be really so? No, no, you shall not deceive me. I know it to be impossible." Elizabeth looked at her sister with incredulous, solicitous attitude, but said nothing. "My dear, dear Lizzie, I do congratulate you, but are you certain, forgive the question, are you quite certain, forgive the question, are you quite certain that you can not make a very favourable poo?" Elizabeth again and more seriously assured her of its truth. "This must be false. This cannot be. This must be the grossest falsehood. But I will not repine. It cannot last long, and we shall all be as we were before. Stinky." She sat down again, and soon afterwards got up and walked about the room. With thoughts that could rest on nothing, she walked on, but it would not do. In half a minute she walked into the breakfast-room, and then walked towards a table where a few books were lying. She sat down for a few moments, and then getting up, walked about the room. The gentlemen did approach. They walked on, without knowing in what direction. Mrs. Bennet and Kitty walked off, and when Mr. Wickham walked into the room, he walked away again immediately, and she was left to fret over her own want of ponies. She then ran gaily off. She then took a large piece in Edward Street. "Ugly fuck," said Elizabeth as she walked towards one of the windows. "I'm glad she has gone. I never saw such a long chin in my life. Miserable, stupid, disagreeable, frack wit, just fit to be killed." About the middle of the next day, as she was in her room getting ready for a walk, a sudden noise below seemed to speak the whole house in confusion, and after listening a moment, she heard her farting arse beginning to tremble with trembling energy. Mr. Darcy, and Mr. Darcy only, entered the room, till they were joined by Mr. Collins, who entered the room. They had not been long together before Darcy told her that Bingley was also coming to wait on her, and in a moment he entered the room. After farting 2 or 3 times in a violent manner and crying out, "Oh, the agony of my undercarriage," she was joined by everybody else in the country, and she was rather surprised to find that she had somehow or other got a turd pretty near the opening of the anus. It was painful, exceedingly painful, and she was rather surprised to find that she had the power of revealing the end of the turd, which was visible in every feature. "Good God!" cried Mr. Collins. It was a large, handsome, stinking shit, standing well, and rising with greater elegance than the furniture of Rosings. With most painful sensations, the colour rose into her cheeks, and she said, "I shall certainly try to get the bastard out." "My fingers wait your orders," said Bingley. "No, no, let me shift myself," replied Elizabeth, with tears in her eyes. "You are not well enough. You cannot go yourself," said Darcy. Elizabeth hesitated, but her knees trembled under her. On his quitting the room she sat down, unable to support herself, and looking so miserably ill that it was impossible for Darcy to leave her, or to refrain from saying, in a tone of gentleness and commiseration, "Let me call your maid. Is there nothing you could take to give you present relief? A glass of wine? Shall I get you one?" "No, I thank you," she replied, endeavouring to recover herself. "Let me call your maid," repeated Darcy. "No," replied Elizabeth. "Let me call your maid," repeated Darcy. "Very well. If it must be so, it must," said Elizabeth angrily. "You're a maid." Elizabeth turned away to hide a smile. "Mr. Darcy is not to be laughed at," thought Elizabeth. "But I dearly love a laugh. And it is such a good joke, too. He. Ha, 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 her. He, her heart. He had. Unable to contain her shit, Elizabeth began shitting with shitty shit. The moment of release was ecstasy. "I do a shit. I do a shit. I do a shite," said Elizabeth, and then, unwilling to let the subject drop, added, "Oh, my dear, but—" The poo was very large and contained great variety of cake. Elizabeth's mind was too full for conversation, but she saw and admired every remarkable spot and piece of corn. Colonel Fitzwilliam seemed really glad to see the poo. It seemed long. He kissed it with affectionate gallantry. "This shit is my best friend," said he, smiling. "Oh, yes," cried Lydia. "I wish I might take this for a hat." Mr. Wickham, after a few moments, touched his cock and said, "I want to put it in my mother's ear for a present." Mr. Gardner expressed a wish of going round the whole poo, dancing to Cheap Trick's greatest hits. "And when your anus is recovered," he added, "you shall, if you please, name the very bird after me." The prospect of such delights was very cheering, and they parted in mutual good spirits. "Very well," said Elizabeth. "His name will be Mr. Gardner. Mr. Fat Gardner. Mr. Fat fucking stupid Gardner. Mr. Fat fucking broad-faced bosom-tempered man. Oh, that abominable Mr. Shitty Shit, Fat fucking foxhound fucking fuckwit, insufferably tedious cock-adjusting circumcised prick, Father Christmas despising dick, Archbishop cheating Archbishop, beating pianoforte penetrating Italian, beating inflexibly stupid rectum, the little cock-sucking cock-face. Miserable motherfucking penis genitals, penis testes, penis simpleton, dick, cunt, full of cunt, fuck, bloody mother, fucking, shitty ass-faced cunt. "Well, my dear," said Mr. Bennet, "you done poo." "Mamma," cried Lydia. "Nothing." Their visitors stayed with them above half a minute, and when they arose to depart, Mr. Darcy called on his sister to join him in expressing their wish of seeing Mr. and Mrs. Gardner being killed by Miss Bingley. But then his eyes fell out. The end.